Hello and welcome back to this downful idealistic crusade. This will be a review of the beautiful Film Preservation Society Blu-ray release of the 1921 masterpiece silent epic, The Three Musketeers, spearheaded, starring, and full of the life force of Douglas Fairbanks Sr., one of the iconic films that forever cemented him as the definitive swashbuckling hero, and as the wonderful biography it is titled, The First King of Hollywood. Fairbanks Sr. is one of the silent icons, but isn't talked about as much today as he should be, which is both perplexing and also completely criminal, because without Fairbanks, there's so much of popular cinema and popular culture that simply wouldn't exist, let alone the fact that the whole notion of making adventure films and period films and what is termed the swashbuckler, let alone what we have with the modern focus on comic book films. None of this would exist without Fairbanks. I mean, you really have to look at the Mark of Zorro in 1920 as the sort of focal point of what Fairbanks embarked upon in his career, and transitioned himself away from the earlier types of films he'd been making and never really went back to them. There are some precursors beforehand, as with most anything, but the Mark of Zorro in 1920 is really what cements the idea of the hero in a film. And if you had to look for what is the first superhero film, it's really the Mark of Zorro. Zorro, the character himself, by Johnston McCulley, is such a foundational character in all of superhero fiction, but it's the Mark of Zorro that cements a lot of the stuff that McCulley did in his first story, The Curse of Capistrano, a year before in 1919, and really bursts the new Doug Fairbanks compared to the image he had as the young upstart character always trying to persevere in his earlier films. You still have a degree of that, but it's the Mark of Zorro that sets him on the path of the iconic swashbucklers, which forever further immortalized his screen image. But this is the Doug Fairbanks we think of. But while The Mark of Zorro was a runaway success and is one of the great silent films and is one of the silent films that everyone should see, it's really The Three Musketeers a year later that cements it, and cements Doug Fairbanks as the swashbuckling icon for all time, and one of the iconic figures of all of cinema. You have a lot of the same people returning, same director, Fred Niblio again, who had done the Mark of Zorro the year before. But The Three Musketeers is trying to build on everything the Mark of Zorro does. It's a bigger film, it's a longer film, it's a more elaborate film. And Fairbanks had wanted to play D'Artagnan for quite some time, if not most of his life. And this is where you really have everyone swinging for the fences. When you compare the two films, it is quite obvious that The Three Musketeers, when compared to The Mark of Zorro, is a much bigger film. Of course, it's based on the iconic literary classics of Alexandre Dumas. So you've of course got to have a bigger film to live up to The Three Musketeers. And it's also a tricky thing to adapt, because you don't just have the one book, you have the multiple different adventures. And if you're just focusing on one, Dumas is not the most concise writer. He gets on up there in the page count and all the characters and descriptions and things. So it's a tricky thing to tackle, to try and do, even if you're just doing The Three Musketeers. Which section of the story are you going to do? Where which book are you going to focus on? And how do you get all that material into a single film narrative? Especially with The Three Musketeers, if you're doing the traditional approach, you also have to have this sort of origin story of D'Artagnan and trying to become a musketeer and making his way to the city. So you've got an origin story built in there as well. So again, this is a very foundational type of story and foundational film in what is now seen as the sort of basic cliche of hero fiction or superhero fiction in terms of comics and Of course, that also stems from pulp characters, but the history goes all the way back to the birth of the cinema, which makes this film just as important as it was in 1921. It's also absolutely timeless because any of the iconic Fairbanks films are so filled with his tenacity and his voracious appetite for life and his boundless energy that they are just as magical to 5-year-olds as they are to 85-year-olds. They are completely timeless, which makes them some of the perfect gateway silent films. The Three Musketeers has everything the Mark of Zorro has, but it also, as I said, it's Fairbanks and company swinging for the fences. They're trying to do as best as they possibly can with the successes they've had, basically being able to finance the film, and this would be carried even further the next year in the iconic Douglas Fairbanks in Robin Hood, where he would tackle Robin of Locksley and the Merry Men of Sherwood Forest, and another of the great silent epics. But the Three Musketeers has sort of gotten overshadowed because it's bookended by Mark of Zorro and Robin Hood, and then you've also got The Thief of Baghdad and The Black Pirate and the other famous Fairbanks swashbucklers. So, it's sort of gotten buried a little bit, hidden a little bit, and it's not as frequently anthologized or mentioned, or it's not even as available in terms of the multitude of terrible public domain crappy editions of silent films in terrible varying states, or the terrible versions that float around online of silent films. You'll still find it because it's public domain, and if anybody wants to release it, it's free to do so. And unfortunately, that's how most silent films are stuck in public domain status. So you'll still very easily find some version of it, but it's not as well publicized or out there as much as the films that sort of surround it, because they have iconic characters that are linked to comics in terms of Mark of Zorro being put around everywhere, and of course Mark of Zorro was remade in 1940 and in the iconic Tyrone Power Fox version, and of course then you have Robin Hood coming after the Three Musketeers and trying to go even bigger, and Thief of Baghdad is a bit more famous and also has its fantastic Alexander Korda remake. So it's been sort of buried a little bit in terms of popular consciousness. That hasn't been helped by the fact that the film was really in dire need of a meticulous restoration for a long time. Like most of the Fairbanks swashbucklers, it did have a couple decent, more official, authorized releases. The most of these are going to be the older Blackhawk Films releases, like what you see here on the Blackhawk Image Laserdisc. So there were a couple different ones, but the primary one of note was Kino Video's old DVD. They had done a number of the big Fairbanks titles on DVD, and even did a little nice little box set, which is unfortunately long out of print. Those discs are very outdated, though. They're from the early to mid 2000s, and they're based on older restorations. They're pretty good, and they're still, unfortunately, about the best you can do for the other titles that haven't been restored, especially Robin Hood. That's the big one that I'm really hoping now gets a restoration and a Blu-ray release. But the Three Musketeers was the same way, and so that was the best you could do. It did have a digital synthesizer score based on original score materials, which was pretty good, but it was still a very limited presentation, and that was the last time I saw it. It was also running at a certain frame rate. I think it was running at 24 frames per second, and that's another thing that silent films really live and die depending on how good the presentation is, and because the frame rates varied along with having proper color tinting and things, that can really affect your the impression a silent film has on you. And so running at 24 frames per second, it runs faster. So the old Kino DVD clocked in at about, I think it was about 2 hours, and it did feel a little I hate to say choppy, but if you've ever seen a silent film projected at a faster frame rate than what is obviously faster than what the original frame rate would have been, it does sort of give it a sort of choppy flavor, and it does harm the viewing experience. So, but unfortunately, that was the best edition that existed. So I was shocked to hear that the Film Preservation Society had embarked on their own new restoration process and released a Blu-ray. Now, the Film Preservation Society is a nonprofit organization. They are doing some really incredible work with not just silent films, but with the entire biograph library of shorts. So they are dedicated to preserving silent film history and culture, and have done a number of Blu-ray releases, which you can look at and order directly from them on their website, which I highly encourage you to do so to support this incredible historical preservation work they're doing. And it definitely shows the attention to care and detail and the commitment to silent film history, because this isn't a money-making venture, and it's not going to be the most popular thing in the world, but it is work that absolutely needs to be done. And if no one else is going to do it, you might as well do it yourself as best as you can. So what this restoration is, which was completed in 2021 for this 2022 Blu-ray, this is taking a 2017 restoration of the film, which was done by the San Francisco Silent Film Festival and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. This was a complete overhaul restoration in 2017 that not only tried to present the film at the correct frame rate, which seems to be about 20 frames per second, which then causes the runtime to be longer. So now it runs at a much more appropriate 2.5 hours. They also tried to recreate the original color tinting as closely as possible to what was known of the original sources. This is all done from 35mm materials. Fairbanks had donated his negatives to the Museum of Modern Art, and so they had been preserved, but unfortunately they had started to deteriorate after they were only a couple decades old. So thankfully a preservation element had been made sometime, I believe, in the 60s, and so that is the source of this restoration. It's not, obviously not perfect. It would be great to still be working from the original negative, but for a 1921 film, it's understandable that deterioration would have set in relatively quickly, and it's obviously not going to be something you could use at this point. This, of course, means they are pretty much stuck with what exists on that preservation element. So that means there are going to be a few things baked in that you will see pop up, and some inherent damage that is unavoidable. But for a film from 1921, that is completely understandable. And if you've ever seen this film before, especially on the really crappy versions, it wasn't looking that great. So already any improvement is a big leap forward. But in 2017, they had to work from what materials they had and what information they had, which wasn't, it was decent, but they didn't have any first-hand sources to go by in terms of surviving print materials. And so in 2017, that was basically as good as they could do, and it was a proper archival restoration. Well, come around in 2021, and you might think, well, what could be done to enhance that? And what happened was they discovered a section of a vintage print element that not only allowed them, along with color timing notes, to properly color tint the film with the exact tones of the original release, but there is a significant usage in the opening sequences of the Handschliegl hand tinting coloring process, which is done to hand tint the yellow horse buttercup that D'Artagnan starts out with, a very vivid buttercup yellow. And this was done throughout the silent era, and there were different processes of specifically tinting actual pieces of individual shots. And so here it's this yellow Handschliegl hand tinting process on the horse itself. Well, that was the segments that had been rediscovered. It was very thankfully parts of those scenes with the Handschliegl process. So this allowed the additional restoration work work to for the 2021 master to build on what the 2017 had done, and to go through and be able to digitally recreate the Handschliegl color tinting for the Buttercup the horse in all the scenes, and to make it as accurate as humanly possible with modern tools. But this also allowed to get the exact color tints, which is mostly a very golden or amber for most of the sequences, except for night scenes. But it allowed the restoration team to get exactly the same color tintings as what would be seen on an original release print of the Three Musketeers. So that is why this release is able to, or I should say the 2021 restoration is able to surpass the 2017 restoration. They did additional cleanup work in both the picture and the intertitles that was not done or not possible on the 2017. They're basically able to go a little bit further in doing further restoration work with additional digital tools that have become available, and be a bit more meticulous in terms of the frame-by-frame cleanup and restoration work. So that results in an even more impressive restoration effort than the 2017 restoration, but it is building upon that work. So you really couldn't have this without the original 2017 restoration. What this results in, and now this is presented on this Blu-ray from 2022 in 1080p, again, running at about 20 frames per second inside the 24 frames per second container. This is an absolutely staggering disc, especially for silent film fans, and if you've ever seen what restorations can do, and most of all, if you've ever seen this film before and how it's looked on video, even if you've seen or own the Kino DVD, this is just light years beyond. The biggest thing you're going to notice is the frame rate. It does run longer, so now it is 2.5 hours. That's not really because of any additional footage, mind you, it's more because it's now running at a more natural rate, and thus you're able to much more easily get involved in the story and the individual actors' nuances. I mean, there are moments where, you know, you can much more clearly see people breathing and reacting, and probably the biggest improvement is when Doug Fairbanks starts doing his legendary acrobatics. You can now actually follow his movements much more easily. It's not as choppy, so when he suddenly, without any effort at all, jumps seemingly 7 or 8 feet in the air over a flying table, you can actually follow it much more easily than you could in the old Kino disc or a lot of the absolutely terrible public domain versions where it just becomes a choppy mess, or it's interlaced and then it's you got all the combing artifacts too. So the biggest difference right off the bat is the frame rate is better. But the clarity that has been mined from this 35mm preservation source is really something. So you're going to run into some unavoidable damage and some artifacts that creep in. So there are the occasional hairs poking in. They are very small and they're very infrequent. So I'd say there's maybe 3 or 4 scattered throughout, but they are very, very minor, and they're thankfully very small too. You will see an occasional line poking through, and you will see some noise on some irising shots, because of course most silent films frequently use the camera iris technique of using the creating the circle iris to come in and out of scenes, basically doing a fade in and fade out in the camera. And of course, any type of effect, you're going to run into some noise and things, and that's baked into the source, and it's natural. All the artifacts you see in this transfer are natural, but they have been as delicately minimized as possible without harming or manipulating the image in any way, shape, or form. That is what a silent film restoration is supposed to do. That's what all film restoration and preservation is supposed to do, is to present the film as best as humanly possible with the tools available at the time without changing or harming the impact or anything from the original production. So finally, this film, along with the meticulous restoration of the color tinting to be exact to match original release print materials, It really allows the photography to shine. This film was shot by the legendary Arthur Edison, who became the sort of primary cameraman of Fairbanks' career. And of course, also go on to shoot Thief of Baghdad, and become, he is one of the most legendary cinematographers of all time. He went on to even shoot The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca, of all things. He has one of the greatest resumes of any cameraman ever, and the fact that he's not a household name in terms of cinematographers is downright criminal. But every aspect of this new presentation is breathtaking. The film remains quite possibly, I think, the best adaptation of the classic Three Musketeers story. It has been done many times, and there have been adaptations of later stories, or The Man in the Iron Mask. There's the fantastic but and rather jovial 1948 MGM Technicolor version with Gene Kelly, which Kelly made because he was such an enormous fan of Fairbanks in this film. And that's great, but it sort of does its own thing, and it's almost got an edge of slight self-mocking humor and satire to it. Then there's the Salkinds, Richard Lester directed 3 and 4 Musketeers in the 70s. There's different versions, but I don't know if any of them have ever quite gotten the intensity of pure spirit that is here, and that's something that no one is ever going to be able to replicate. You cannot. You could merely follow in the footsteps of what is in the iconic Douglas Fairbanks swashbucklers. No one is ever going to match that pure magic, that spirit of adventure, and just that life force that's there. That's why these are some of the most iconic silent film treasures of all of silent cinema, and that really comes across here. I've seen this film before several times, of course. I've seen the old Kino DVD, but it has never felt as alive as it does on this transfer. This is a revelatory restoration of a silent film treasure. It is one of the finest Blu-ray presentations of a silent film I've ever seen. It's one of the best silent film Blu-ray releases ever, and thus one of the best silent film home video releases ever. It is worth every penny of the purchase price and more. And if you have never seen this film, or if you've never seen a Douglas Fairbanks swashbuckler, you are going to be transported. And even though it is now longer technically in terms of the runtime, it is more appropriate to how the film speed of how the film was shot. And while it's now technically longer than the old Kino DVD, it flows better because the image feels more natural. And again, you're able to just really invest yourself in the skullduggery of Cardinal Richelieu and D'Artagnan and the Three Musketeers trying to save France itself. It remains just as timeless, magical, and breathlessly exciting as all of Fairbanks' iconic swashbucklers. And this is really the film. It's there in Mark of Zorro, but again, this is where the image, the immortal image of Doug Fairbanks Sr., the swashbuckling hero of all time, this is where it's cemented. This is even where the iconic Fairbanks mustache that he wore for the rest of his career, pretty much. This is where you first get that. And, of course, he grew it to play D'Artagnan. And, again, he had wanted to play D'Artagnan for years and years and years and years. So this was also a sort of, you could maybe call it a dream project in that sense. And this is the type of film where you can sense someone puts every fiber of their being into it, and there is no way that Fairbanks was ever going to. I don't think he could even consider the concept of half-assing anything, and to see this film at the proper speed in this restoration and be able to experience the sheer physicality of his movements, of his acting, of his performance, of his larger-than-life essence, and then be able to just be bowled over, as always, by the action set pieces and the sword fights and the acrobatics. There is no one who has ever or will ever move in that same way. And that is why the frame rate being accurate is so vital, because you have to be able to experience just Fairbanks's movements in the proper speed, because to not have that, it's the same thing if any of Keaton or Chaplin or Lloyd's iconic silent comedies are not in the proper frame rate. It's harder to track the movement, and thus the gags and the painstakingly timed set pieces don't work as well, because it's not at the correct film speed, or it's not presented properly, and thus the movement is thrown off. Well, it's the same thing here, and perhaps more so, because Fairbanks is so vividly alive that it's hard to imagine how a cinematographer and a camera at that time would be able to capture that. And you get to see it here, just in such quality that it really has that effect of transporting the viewer. This is a mesmerizing presentation through and through, and that is enhanced by a brand new score by the Mont Alto Motion Picture Orchestra, who really excels in creating new scores for silent film classics. They have done so much great work that just to say their name in terms of the score, it's going to be a fantastic score. So comparing to the Kino, again, the Kino does have a synthesizer score that's based on the original score, so technically that is, I guess, more historically accurate in that sense, and that's really the only reason why you might want to hold on to that disc if you like that score. But the score here is so perfectly timed and nuanced, and just enmeshes into every scene that, again, with the clarity of the visuals being such and the beauty of the restoration, it does enhance the overall experience, and it is perfectly modulated to every scene. It's beautifully light and airy in the right places for the sort of romantic scenes. It's wonderfully boisterous and red-blooded in all the action scenes. It is an incredible score. And very interestingly, while the quality is excellent, it is only encoded as a lossy Dolby Digital track. It is not a lossless encoding, but that doesn't detract from the overall presentation of the score. So that was a bit surprising, and probably one of the only things that I would myself wish had been done a little bit differently. It would have been nice to have the score presented in a lossless stereo instead of just lossy Dolby Digital, but there hasn't been any sort of manipulation to the track, and so that it's an old standard. But if you have a well-mastered piece of audio, it's not going to matter as much if it's in an old lossy Dolby Digital container versus a modern lossless container. It would be nice if it was lossless, but I can understand this being a small non-profit release, that maybe the licensing was too expensive or something. But it would have been nice to have gotten a lossless version, because the score is excellent. But again, the audio quality is still fantastic throughout, so don't let that discourage you, because the score isn't lossless. It is in stereo. It is a stereo recording, but honestly, I prefer that for silent films, because I've not really heard a 5.1 mix of a silent film score, of a new score, that's really been as effective to me as a really wonderful full-bodied stereo score is. Unless it was recorded multi-channel, that's different, because most silent film scores are still recorded stereo and then usually upmixed to 5.1. Some work okay, but I still always wind up preferring stereo for silent films. There's just something that surround tracks for silence, it just it never quite works for me. There's some sort of disconnect I have, and maybe that's just me, but I do prefer a full-bodied stereo track for a silent film versus a 5.1 mix. So in short, the new presentation in both picture and sound is absolutely revelatory. Being a film from 1921, there is going to be some unavoidable damage baked into the original source, but again, it is very minimal. And the new restoration has gone the extra mile to try and work with that source and go through and be as meticulous as possible in trying to clean up things without harming or manipulating the original image. And this even goes into the intertitles, which have been cleaned up in terms of noise and damage, and there's not really any sort of weaving either, which is really remarkable and helpful for a silent film, because a lot of times you're for any element, especially an element that old, you're going to have a lot of weave or frame movement, and especially noticeable on intertitles because, of course, it's still text usually on a black screen. So that was extremely well done and very much appreciated. You're just going to see a stray line here or there, a stray, very small hair, very rarely poking in on the side of the frame, and a little bit of wear and tear here and there, a little bit of additional light here and there. The biggest amounts of damage, there are only two spots towards the end of the film, well past the 2-hour mark, where it seems pretty much unavoidable with the element they were having to work from, and it is minimized as much as possible, but you can tell that there is some baked in damage, but because this is really the lone best element they have, they're having to use and work with what they have. So it is minimized. It doesn't really detract from the image or the experience, but again, there are those two places that do have some baked in damage that is visible but minimized, and again, it doesn't detract from the experience. But again, those are really the two biggest amounts. Everything else is very, very small and minimal, and that makes this presentation just absolutely incredible. This disc is also extremely well mastered. It is pretty much maxing out at the around the max Blu-ray encoding rate. So the bit rate is frequently a full 35 megabits per second, and rarely dips below 30. It is wonderfully encoded, which you rarely see on silent film titles. Usually they will skimp here and there, or they have a whole lot of other extras and things. And this is a longer film, so the last thing you want is it to not have a good disc encoding. So I think without question, it's the silent film release of the year in terms of physical media, and is a must-own for all silent film fans. Now, to talk about the packaging, we have a very simple, straightforward, but lovely looking standard Blu-ray release. This has original poster artwork of Doug Fairbanks from the original one sheet with the Film Preservation Society logo. A very simple but effective spine. Then the rear with a very simple but effective white background, good text, the credits for the Society, Museum of Modern Art, the Library of Congress, who also participated, and then also the extras listing. The case has that sort of hinge that you get, that sort of clasp hinge. And then we get the interior, which has a nice disc label. Then we also have actual other alternate poster artwork included. So you get two of those as the interior artwork. The booklet is wonderful and filled with excellent stills and great historical background by Tracy Gossel, who is not only the real founder and head of the Film Preservation Society, but also Fairbanks' biographer. Her book is The First King of Hollywood. So she goes over some of that information here, and it is loaded with great stills, but you also get notes about the restoration and how it builds upon the 2017 restoration. But then there's also a little bit about one of the extra shorts included and historical background information on that. Then we get the credits for both the cast and crew and the restorations as the back of the booklet. Now, in terms of the extras, these are, they seem slight, but they are very well done and extremely important for historical background as well. So we do have a restoration featurette. It's a short but very informative, about 3-minute piece where they talk about how the 2017 restoration was done. They show some images and clips of that, and then what the 2021 work did and what they were able to do to build on that. And they do have some comparisons as well. So it's short, but it is absolutely absolutely spot on and tells you everything you need to know about how important this new work was and how it built upon the 2017 restoration. There is a very extensive image gallery that's broken up into multiple different sections, which has original posters, production stills, lobby cards, original glass slides, and images of the original press book release. It is very extensive, and again, it's broken up into multiple galleries. There is, of course, the 8-page booklet that I went over, and then there are 2 shorts included that have been newly scanned and restored. The one that ties directly is, of course, the 1917 short entitled All-Star Production of Patriotic Episodes for the Second Liberty Loan. And this is literally famous stars of the time trying to encourage people to buy savings bonds to help support the war effort. And not only is it a fantastic historical document, I guess you even have Woodrow Wilson showing up at the end. Of course, you get to see vintage footage of both Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks, among others. And Fairbanks gets this amusing gag of he goes up to a bank counter, and when the guy steps away because he's determined he's got to get his bonds, he literally vaults over the window of the bank counter and gets his bonds and vaults back over because, of course, what's Doug Fairbanks going to do at a bank? Of course, he's not going to stand there and wait. He's going to literally jump over the wall and get behind the teller's window. And that's been beautifully cleaned up and presented. I believe it was a new scan with the Library of Congress. So it's a fascinating historical document and inclusion, and wonderful to see it in this level of quality. It is, again, in HD, so it is a preservation scan, but it's fascinating to look at. The other inclusion is from the Society's Biograph Preservation Project. They are trying to preserve as many of the classic Biograph silent shorts as possible. This is a 1910 D.W. Griffith directed short entitled The Call to Arms, with a very simple story but some interesting visuals, and it does also feature Mary Pickford in a small role. So, of course, it is incredibly important for the famous names involved being part of the Biograph series, and these are things that just so need to be preserved. So this again shows the level of commitment that the Society is going to. This is a new scan and part of their preservation work, so it is in far better quality than I've seen any of the various Biograph shorts before. But unfortunately, the one real problem of this entire disc shows up here, because unfortunately it seems that in the sort of cleanup project, this short has had the sort of frozen green effect magnified all over it, because there has been some cleanup work done, but when you see the figures moving around, they have the really big telltale frozen green halos, which is really unfortunate because the scan looks nice and the quality is far beyond anything I've ever seen for any of the Biograph shorts that I've seen before on older releases. So it's very unfortunate. I don't know if that was maybe somehow done in the disc encoding process or something, but it looks like it's been degrained, and then there's a very thick and noticeable green halo that's frozen around people's heads and stuff, and it really does detract from the preservation status of this. It still looks great overall, but it's really marred by that. That's unfortunately something that's happening more and more on a lot of restorations and, of course, physical media disc releases as well. It's really unfortunate, though, for it to turn up on really important historical preservation pieces like this. And I do want to stress, this is nowhere in the feature transfer. It's only, and it's not on the other short. It's merely on this one Biograph short. So again, I don't know if maybe this happened in terms of it getting encoded as a extra on the disc, or it was just part of done as the cleanup process for restoring this short before it was put on the disc. But that was really unfortunate. So that's really the only downside of this disc is, unfortunately, the Biograph short has been hit with a lot of grain removal and has the telltale frozen grain halos. That was unfortunate because Otherwise, this is a perfect disc, and I still think it's an essential release. But again, that I have been seeing that pop up more and more on all kinds of different catalog titles and various restorations. So again, I don't know. It might simply be due to how it was encoded as an extra on here. I'm not for sure. The only other thing I would say about this is I do wish the audio did have a lossless option, but I can understand that because again, you do have to license, for DTS HDMA or Dolby True HD, you do have to pay a licensing fee, and of course it is a 2.5 hour feature with a maxed out bit rate, so you do have to worry about space concerns, and there are still extras too. But it would have been nice. I would have liked and preferred to have had a lossless score presentation, but those are my only two qualms. That the Biograph short has some grain problems, and that I wish the score had been lossless. But other than that, it is an absolutely breathtaking, must-own, essential disc. It is one of the best discs of 2022. It is the best silent film release of 2022, and I strongly urge you, if you're at all interested, to go to the Film Preservation Society's website and support the incredible work they're doing. They have done several releases now, and they've also done a double feature release on Blu-ray of additional very rare Fairbanks films. So I was able to pick this up as well because they were having a sort of bundle sale, and so you can pick up this release as well, which I will review for the channel, of two very rare Fairbanks films from before his swashbuckling period. But they were also running a special that actually did a bundle of the Three Musketeers release with a copy of Gossel's incredible biography of Fairbanks that I've read excerpts from, but I just had been meaning to read the whole thing. So I'm super excited to finally be able to read this. And of course, it's the lovely hardcover edition. And if that wasn't enough, it's also autographed. So that was just a beautiful touch. And of course, the inscription just speaks volumes. So that is the level of intensive care and commitment to the preservation of silent film history that you experience with the Film Preservation Society. So do visit their website and absolutely support their work by purchasing some of their Blu-ray releases and other books and items that are available there. They're doing incredible work, and even if the Blu-rays are a bit higher than your standard sort of mass releases, it is understandable because it is a small nonprofit organization. It is expensive to make and manufacture Blu-rays and do restoration work. So even if it is a bit more than you would normally pay for a Blu-ray release, it is absolutely worth your money to pick up these releases and support their incredible work and efforts that are resulting in absolutely mesmerizing releases like this Blu-ray release of the 1921 Douglas Fairbanks masterpiece edition of The Three Musketeers, one of the great silent films, now finally and properly presented in the finest quality that any of us have ever seen it in, I think, and definitely the best it's looked and sounded since the original 1921 release. So those are my thoughts on the Film Preservation Society Blu-ray release of the 1921 Fairbanks masterpiece, The Three Musketeers, one of the finest silent film video releases ever, and easily the best silent film Blu-ray release of 2022, one of the best discs of 2022, and I think the must-own silent film release of 2022. An absolutely breathtaking presentation with some lovely extras and worth every single penny of the purchase price and more. So please do go to the Film Preservation Society and purchase directly from them to show your support for incredible restoration and preservation work like seen here with the iconic 1921 The Three Musketeers. And as always, I hope my babbling about classic films and physical media releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative. And as the inscription says, may your swash never buckle, and thank you ever so much for watching. With a copy of Gossel. Somewhere, Doug, you are laughing your ass off.